Every day, medical coders operate at the boundary of two conflicting languages: the nuanced, often hesitant vocabulary of clinical providers and the rigid, absolute logic of coding guidelines. For a physician, writing borderline conveys clinical hesitation. It suggests a patient is hovering on the edge of a diagnosis, requiring observation over immediate intervention. But translating that clinical hesitation into a medical code requires a strict set of rules. This specific friction is resolved by ICD-10-CM guideline B.17. This guideline strips away the physician's hesitation. When a chart reads borderline hypertension, the coding logic forces a definitive choice. The condition is locked in as a confirmed diagnosis. Guideline B.17 dictates that a borderline condition must be coded as definitively confirmed. It is never treated as uncertain. This creates a sharp dividing line in medical terminology. Borderline operates under a completely different set of rules than actual terms of uncertainty, like possible, suspected, or rule out. The confirmed status remains permanent, while those genuinely uncertain terms dissolve from the coding equation. Borderline stands alone as an absolute. To process these diagnoses without error, we need to construct a complete step-by-step mental algorithm that accounts for this rule and its specific exceptions. Failing to follow this sequence leads to a predictable chain of errors. Coders routinely treat borderline conditions as uncodable suspicions, or they assign standard codes without checking the index. Resolving this paradox requires strict mechanical execution. Relying on this algorithm prevents misdiagnoses and protects the facility from costly compliance failures. We translate this guideline into a reliable operational workflow by establishing a base starting point. This flowchart represents the first stage of our decision matrix. When the provider documentation explicitly states a condition is borderline, the immediate default pathway leads directly to coding it as confirmed. This foundational axiom is the required initial assumption for any borderline chart. You must consciously shut down any instinct to treat the diagnosis as unconfirmed. The pathways for possible or rule out are entirely blocked off in this workflow. A threshold term like borderline indicates the patient has crossed a clinical line into reportability. The condition exists and is being managed, whereas a rule out term indicates the condition might not exist at all. Mechanically, your first step is always to prepare to assign the standard confirmed code for whatever base condition the provider documented. This requires decisive action. You identify the condition, isolate it, and treat it as a factual certainty on the page. Locking in this default action streamlines the initial phase of coding, eliminating second-guessing and subjective interpretation. However, assigning that standard confirmed code immediately and closing the chart is a mistake. The foundational axiom strictly sets your initial direction, but executing it blindly without checking for exceptions creates a massive compliance blind spot. To eliminate that blind spot, we introduce the most crucial operational constraint: mandatory verification. We insert a new decision gate directly after identifying the borderline condition. Before finalizing any code, you must check the alphabetic index. The results found in the index legally supersede the default rule. The index tells you exactly how ICD-10-CM classifies that specific condition. You are searching for a distinct, condition-specific borderline subentry nested beneath the main term. Borderline diabetes provides the clearest case study for why this exception exists. Tracing the main term diabetes in the alphabetic index, you must scan further down to locate the specific subentry explicitly labeled borderline. The existence of this subentry completely reroutes your assignment. Instead of assigning a standard confirmed diabetes code, the index forces you to a specific code designed entirely for the borderline state. If your search yields a negative result, meaning no borderline subentry exists, you revert to the foundational axiom, assigning the code for the confirmed condition. The alphabetic index acts as the ultimate arbiter, taking a generalized guideline and refining it into a precise, compliant code assignment. ICD-10-CM rules frequently split based on admission status, forcing coders to apply different logic for inpatient versus outpatient encounters. Guideline B.17 is entirely immune to these setting-based variations. Adding the setting constraint to our decision matrix proves its universality. For borderline conditions, inpatient logic is identical to outpatient logic. Whether admitted to a trauma ward or seen for a routine visit, this coding pathway remains locked. But stepping away from the strict rules and into the clinical environment, coders face a messier reality. Provider documentation is often ambiguous. Sentences blur the line between a diagnosis and a suspicion, leaving the actual clinical intent completely unclear. Attempting to guess a provider's intent when the status is poorly phrased compromises the integrity of the medical record. To prevent this, we install the final fail-safe mechanism directly into the decision tree. If the documentation is unclear, the pathway diverges to a formal query. Halting your workflow to execute a provider query is not optional in the face of ambiguity. It is a mandatory step to secure definitive documentation. Combining strict standardization across all care settings with a rigid query protocol entirely removes subjective guesswork from the coder's methodology. We now have a completed end-to-end operational workflow for processing borderline diagnoses. This visual matrix dictates every action you take. You confirm the diagnoses, run the mandatory index verification, verify the specific or default code regardless of setting, and trigger the query failsafe if the text is ambiguous. But professional coders consistently break this algorithm at two highly specific nodes. The structural failures occur right here, at the very beginning by illegally treating the condition as uncertain, and in the middle by bypassing the alphabetic index entirely. These structural failures guarantee incorrect code assignments. They erase legitimate diagnoses from the patient's history and artificially lower the acuity of the reported encounter. Ignoring this rigid algorithm leads directly to measurable compliance failures and actively corrupts healthcare data. To permanently cement Guideline B.17 into your workflow, AMCI relies on a specific memory concept. This is the MJ gem. Borderline equals the bottom line. Code it, because in the strict logic of ICD-10-CM, borderline counts. Applying that rule ensures a methodical, fully compliant coding practice every single time.